Hi guys, welcome to the Debrief. We're here with Will McCartney, founder of Habeas. Welcome, Will.
Thank you very much. I'm super excited to be here today and have a chat. Yeah.
We're excited to have you too. So,
Cool. Will, so what was the specific aha moment that made you realize the necessity of a tool like Habeas in the Australian legal landscape?
Yeah, so when I started out back in 2023, I think generative AI, there was like a lot of excitement around it. But I also kind of foresaw at that time, just like even with the earlier models, there was like a lot of capacity for mistakes, what's now being referred to in the profession as hallucinations and right. So on the one hand, you have this incredible tool that could be used as like an analysis and inference layer and as like an answering machine effectively, which is what a lot of lawyers have been wanting for decades, really. But at the same time, I kind of foresaw that, that's going to create a lot of hand-in-hand problems. There's going to need to be some kind of like bridge between the old way of doing things and the established way of doing things, especially in a profession like the law, where it is incredibly important to do things by the book, and then bridging that with like the newer potential of like emerging Gen AI technology, right? So I did foresee that research in particular would be a newly open space and like, there'd be a lot of scope to innovate and create new solutions in that area. And the other thing I saw is actually like apart from generative AI, like there was a lot of advances in search technology, which hadn't fully been leveraged or maybe come into like the Australian wider landscape. So not just generative AI, but also like AI search type forms of technology. And so if we could marry those two things in an interesting way, like maybe we could create a slightly better search experience for people, right? And research experience in their day-to-day lives, yeah. But that's a bit of a summary, I guess, yeah.
nice. Sounds like there would have been a lot of learnings through that journey from 2023. I guess what's probably the biggest one that stood out for you?
Yeah, so I think in terms of learnings, I think one big one that stood out is you can build a great product, and I think but that's only really half the journey. So the hardest struggle now is about like figuring out a way to differentiate in some creative way on distribution or your sales strategy. And there are a few like pathways to doing that. Like there's not just one, but really it is almost like the key skill for business owners to learn. Whereas I think maybe 3 to 5 years ago, that wasn't the case. You could get by with a really excellent like product-led company and people would just sort of see, wow, there's this excellent new product. Like we do need to buy into this. But now the rules of the game have changed with software being like easier to build. And also there being like a lot of confusion in the market when people are being pitched so many different solutions. It could be from a company that's just started 6 months ago, but they have a lot of funding. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors, particularly in like legal tech. So you really need that creative way to like win on distribution. I think that's been the hard learning for me is like, figuring out the smart way to market and sell your product is the most paramount thing. And it's almost where you should be allocating most of your time as a founder, basically.
Yeah, great insight. And I guess just generally speaking, Will, interested in your story. And even like, so what's your background? What sort of led you to this point? And I'm curious to know if there's always been a tech law overlap there for you.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess my background personally is I always loved the humanities growing up more than anything. So like in high school, I studied a lot of like English, history. We do the HSC here in Sydney, obviously. So it's like, I think I did something like 4 units of history, 5 units of English, or could have been the other way around. But yeah, basically big into that sort of stuff in a high school context. I didn't actually take maths in the HSC, like just because it wouldn't have been the best strategic move for like my ATAR. And then I ended up studying for a year at Cambridge in a degree called HSPS, which is like sociology, politics, IR, all that sort of stuff, right? But I do think, then COVID threw a bit of a spanner in the works in terms of like for international students, for a lot of people in their personal and their family lives and stuff. And so I ended up, the journey almost shifted in the sense of, an external event comes in, you've got to adapt a little bit and think about how can we, make the most of this or figure out a different way forward that's going to suit the new circumstances. So that was actually when I transferred into UCID Arts Law. So I added law on top and just sort of continued in the work I was kind of interested in arts, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, in terms of the tech side, it was actually through uni then, because like COVID and the pandemic not only provided an opportunity where like a lot of people were actually at home more. So, you know, we weren't able to get out as much, etc. But I was always deeply interested in tech, which I can talk about a bit more. But I think I became specifically interested in more thinking of it as a career option, if that makes sense. So rather than a personal fascination or whatever, thinking about like, how can I learn some of the requisite skills to build something in this space? But yeah, back in terms of like the tech side of things, I've always been probably quite interested in that. Like I remember when I was 12 or 13, like my parents bought me my first gaming PC, which was like a Christmas present. It was, you know, secondhand off Gumtree, you know, slightly old parts and everything. But to me, it was like, you know, really amazing what it could do already at that point in time, like with like a great sort of little graphics card in there. And I was like, actually probably before I was interested in like coding and that side of things, I was interested in like back in high school, a bit of gaming actually. So I think you see that with some founders and people in that space actually, is they used to be interested a little bit in gaming. I don't get as much time for it these days, unfortunately. But yeah, and then I was always kind of like interested in advances in technology. And I think circling that back into the present, like it's a good kind of synthesis of like, you can have the humanities side, which allows you to think about things in a slightly different way than the average tech founder maybe, but then also bringing in like that technical coding side or development side, or thinking about things from like a deep tech angle. So it's like an interesting balance of things that I'm interested in, I guess. Yeah. But happy to explain a bit more, but yeah, that's just a bit of a summary. Yeah.
Nice one.
I might explain why I'm interested in tech. I used to be such a gamer when I was a kid. Yeah.
Yeah.
We haven't actually had that come up too much just yet.
Yeah.
That's an interesting insight.
Yeah. And I remember like listening to a podcast by like one of the recent podcasts I think done with one of the Relevance AI founders.
Okay.
And he did actually mention a similar thing, like he was super into gaming. So I wasn't like necessarily super into it, but I did a bit of the sort of competitive stuff a little bit just when I was younger, and it was like something to do on the weekends. And you know, that also got me interested in just like the online world as well, like online media. And I think that like a certain generation of people now, like who have grown up in that world, you know, then later on potentially realize like, oh, there's all these incredible resources for learning online. And so you kind of have that transition over where, you know, you can learn a lot, you can, without having to invest too much money as well. Like if you're just a student, you can get some of the best resource, some of the best learning from people who are like top of the field through, you know, sites like YouTube, but also specialized content platforms. And I think that also informed like when I was starting to build Habeas, like we were on the cutting edge of so many of these new technologies and tech stacks that are just still emerging, like they're still in flux. So we were learning from that. And, you know, a lot of that had to be self-learned, because if I was using a textbook from AI or, you know, learning in say a university setting, it would be several years behind like what's state of the art almost. So that wouldn't have helped as much for building a product, let's say. Yeah.
That's a really interesting insight, actually. Yeah. Would you say that ability to, I guess, be a lifelong learner or autodidact is sort of key in this space as well, being a founder and sort of being able to do, we spoke a few podcasts ago about being a generalist, like the need to be a generalist sort of, if not in this space, then in the modern world, generally speaking. So do you feel like that's a through line?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's something like a lot of founders share is like they try to be polymaths. They like to be across a range of topics. I think it's more that mentality of like, hey, I know I've got a skill set here. Like for me, I know I'm good in the more the humanities realm, but at the same time, I don't want to like exclude myself from say learning to code or learning the principles of like engineering, right? Rather than thinking like you're locked into this one space for life.
Yeah.
You can like become quite good at different skills. Saying that, I still think, you know, some of the best teams, like they have someone who is, you know, a technical co-founder who is excellent in that role, and they have someone who's excellent at sales. So while there's a lot of scope as like a solo founder to learn both sides, and that's quite a good thing for personal development, I think some of the best companies end up diversifying, or if it's not the founders, they like hire a team of people who can make up for your weaknesses and your strengths, right? Because there are just going to be things that, yeah, you can learn how to do them, but you're never going to be quite the best at that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So Will, Habeas places a pretty big emphasis on the ethical side. So I guess what can you just talk through the safeguards and design principles that you've started to integrate into the platform to, I guess, cater for that side of the industry?
Yeah, 100%. So I think in the legal space and in legal research in particular, like one of the big concerns at the moment is like the biggest concern is like fake citations being brought into submissions. So like there's been a few recent, cases where practitioners were maybe reprimanded because they've sort of taken an output from something like Copilot and just taken it at face value. They haven't actually done the sort of deeper reading into every citation that's been cited, right? And in the worst cases, obviously, it's just an entirely like fake citation, doesn't exist. There's no actual case, etc. So
just quickly on that, the case that ended up in the federal court, a couple of weeks ago, last month. To be fair to the lawyer, he did have an agentic workflow set up. So he used Claude to do the research, and then Copilot to validate the research. Right. Which I thought like at least he was doing that. He was double checking, using one language model to check the work of another language model, but it was sort of still slipping through the gaps.
Yeah. And look, I do think it's quite interesting to see like some practitioners do have like some of the more technical practitioners I've met do have like entire workflows. Either they're hiring like an external dev team, or they're like, for example, IP lawyers in Australia often have a coding background. So sometimes I've met a few IP lawyers. This is by no means the norm, who are like setting up their own technical workflows and systems. Ultimately, though, yes, I think you can land in hot water if you're not utilizing tools and systems that cater to that problem specifically. So a big thing that we do with Habeas is we're almost a lot of the time we're search first and then inference second. So like the LLM layer is like the cherry on top. It's something that we've already done a retrieval step over real case law, real legislation, and retrieved like a kind of an array of relevant sources and material. And then Habeas is almost like synthesizing information it's found from existing commentary or from existing primary sources, right? And in the first instance, that means it's never kind of like starting out from the base of like just with a standard LLM, where you are going to expose to a greater hallucination risk because of like the underlying way these models are designed. So a lot of that under the hood is like RAG-based workflows that we've been working on since early 2023. And by the way, like, retrieval augmented generation, that term basically at a base level just kind of means you've got, I'm explaining, you guys probably will know all about this, but just in case anyone in the audience isn't aware, we've got systems that actually are doing that initial retrieval step in a sophisticated and intelligent way, and then having a generation layer on top of that, an analytical layer. But you can then start to incorporate more sophisticated stuff. So you can think about how can you weave together primary and secondary material to enhance the chance that the output you give or the answer you give is more relevant to the practitioner. It's more informed by, say, recent case law as well, or recent principles that have come into the law. So you can start building like AI agent workflows, which we've got on the platform, which again have a slightly more sophisticated layer of analysis. So, one half of our platform is like the search engine, where oftentimes it's just giving a summary of all the cases that have been retrieved, and people can use it with or without the generative AI layer. So if people are looking for more a sophisticated deep research style analysis, they can actually draw on like multiple external sources, and Habeas can break down that initial question into multiple sub-questions and then search across those different questions and put together a research report on that basis. But yeah, there's a lot of principles that go into like mitigating the risk of hallucinations, but I think the most basic thing is just ensuring that at all times, at the very least, it's like referring to real case law, real law, and we give a way for our practitioners to check what actually happened in that case. What sub-paragraph is Habeas deriving this from? Because I think with any type of LM, there's no provider like on the market at the moment who has actually fully has eradicated hallucinations, so to speak. But we can mitigate it, and we can also mitigate, the risk of someone landing in hot water around, improper use of generative AI by relying on, say, fake citations or something like that. Yeah.
So I think the judge in that case, through the book, that practitioner, would solicitors need to validate the outputs from Habeas, or?
Yeah, I think as a general rule, yes. So I think what they need to validate is like Habeas almost gives them that interface where they can do that in real time incredibly quickly. So like when Habeas generates a particular research report, it really depends on like which part of the platform they're using. But let's say in the search engine, the first thing is when someone types a question in there, we're not saying, we make this very clear, it's not like this is the one objective answer to that question. That's not what it is. People can filter down on, say, Commonwealth law or New South Wales case law. So that's going to change the scope of sources that Habeas is retrieving from, right? And of course, its answer is going to be limited to drawing on sources from that material. And then the AI-generated summary, at least within the search engine, is usually going to also then have like a copious amount, almost like oversighted to a certain degree, but so that any legal claim, someone can validate that and think about, okay, well, what is its recency? Do I still think that this is like the best law? Do I think this is the best test? So those sorts of decisions are still really important to the practitioner. We do find that sometimes people will take something from Habeas, use it as like a bit of a first draft, and then they'll also use external tools. Like, so we've got established search platforms that do other things here in Australia, like Jade, right? And they can be excellent for other capabilities that Habeas doesn't do and isn't focused on. So I've seen a lot of practitioners say, like, I'll use it to Habeas, I'll get 80% of the way there, then I'll take a couple of the authorities from Habeas and whack them into Jade. So it is almost this like insight layer that people are using to do deep dives on certain legal issues. And it's also, there is a element of skill, definitely, to like how people, for example, prompt the platform. And if they say prompt Habeas in a way that, like a keyword search platform, they're not going to get good results, right? They're not going to get good answers because it's actually meant to be used as a ask a question, ask an analytical research question, which has some tension in it or has some complexity to it. And, you know, that's the sort of thing where Habeas can excel, but if someone prompted it like they would traditional search engines, the results wouldn't be as good. So there's also that skill level, and we find that some practitioners really like mold to that very, very quickly because they've already used ChatGPT or they use something else in the Gen AI space, and they immediately get like what this excels at and what it's for. So yeah, that's the thing, is we do of course recommend people use it as like an insight and analysis and research tool rather than just saying, hey, look, if I've got this complex matter or case, I'm just going to whack it all into Habeas, copy paste, and I'm done. Like, obviously that's not good practice from a legal perspective, but they're using it for, you know, insight generation and really complex sort of analysis tasks and stuff. Definitely.
Just a quick question on that, around the user experience element. Are you finding that legal professionals operate a little bit differently, or like what sort of analysis are you doing and then feeding that back into the platform? Because I find it really interesting that, you know, you find people who sort of adjust to the UI or how the tool works really easily, and then you have people who it's a bit of a boundary. And I think this sort of speaks to a bigger challenge that, you know, for some people, say using your ChatGPT point, some people get a lot out of it, and then other people sort of use it a couple of times, realize that it doesn't quite give them the answer that they want for one reason or another, and then just sort of abandon it. So
yeah, I think
what are you guys doing?
There's a bit of a like difference I see between different types of lawyers. So I think some lawyers will, because they're already approaching a tool or a platform with a lot of skepticism, you'll get that stream and they're almost expecting to fail. So they might run one search. I've had a few practitioners that might run one search through Habeas, the sort of search that is probably, you know, maybe not really intended for, like, hey, find me subsection of table A of this piece of legislation, etc. Well, that's not really the sort of question we handle, because we're looking at more like analytical, subjective style legal research questions. So you get that type, but I think they are rarer than the other type, which is a lot of people who are really super willing to like, hey, can this tool just add value to my practice, right? Can it get me 80% of the way there? Can it save me time? Can it help make me some money as well? And it doesn't like, so they're not quite looking for that idea of like a perfect magic 8-ball style tool. And they're willing to work within like the constraints of like what's possible with state-of-the-art technology. And they're just really happy to embrace that they've got something that's at least quantitatively better than the existing search tools that they use. And that's what I think a lot of times people forget, is like a lot of traditional search platforms and traditional research workflows just have so much frustration associated with them that, you know, generative AI and then semantic search and other technologies do represent like a substantial leap forward. But it's now, we've got this interesting tension where like some people are used to Claude and ChatGPT, where it's almost like these tools often prioritize like excessive amounts of information, like that actually can be highly detailed, but of course lands people in hot water for when it's not specialized for that use case. So Yeah, that's the first thing. And then, of course, the other thing is just really designing a good user interface and like making it clean and intuitive for people is so important. And I think it's particularly important in like professional services. And we didn't have that until this year. So even last year, we were running pilots with a few firms and found that there was still feedback like, this is too clunky, this is too complex. I have to do too many clicks, too many buttons on this particular workflow. So finding that really interesting synthesis point where like the user interface is simple enough that anyone could really navigate it or get to grips with it. But then you also are trying to store a highly complex like back end behind the front end and like, you know, abstract that away from a user who really just wants the ability to ask their question and get the result they need or get the answer they need, you know. Yeah, so those are the few things I'd say, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. It is that progressive disclosure concept, isn't it? Like taking the user through, figuring out what the user wants and taking them through that journey. So it sounds like that's sort of where you're at. Where 100%. Do you see and where do you want to take Habeas? Where do you see Habeas in 5 years?
Yeah, so I think like in terms of next steps for Habeas, it's now we've kind of done the product consolidation layer. Now it's about like go to market and figuring out like effectively which market can we serve the best. So right now it's looking like the small to mid-sized market, like in Australia in particular. And what are like some of those underserved markets as well that we might not have thought about initially, like for example, universities and people who want to leverage generative AI in like a different way, in a more responsible way, and teach their students like how this tech works under the hood. I think that's been a bit of a clarity point, which is that we do have some enterprise clients or pilots going on, right? But those pilots can be really long term. It can take a very long time, obviously, to land that client or not, or see where they're at and which tools they want to adopt. And so, just really focusing down on like which markets make sense for us and what sort of people are looking for these kinds of tools and what state-of-the-art technology, but don't currently feel like they have enough access to it, and then finding good ways to reach those people in the next few years. But I don't yet have a plan for 5 years out from now, because like personally as a founder, I don't plan for 5 years now. I just think the market moves too quickly and there's too many variables. I almost have like a 6 month to 1 year time frame in my head roughly, and then it's kind of just like doing the best within that you can almost effectively.
Just I guess on that point, I'm curious, you mentioned talking about markets and looking at untapped markets. Who's the ideal Habeas client? Like what do they look like?
Yeah, so at the moment I can say like where we're at right now, and I think this could evolve and change as time grows, but our ideal client, like our average user at the moment, tends to be people in a smaller practice setting, and it could be anywhere from like, it could be a firm from 1 to 20 users, or it could be a slightly larger firm, but usually it's people who are doing quite heavy like litigation style work, or it could be in injury, so something where the law moves quickly, or there's a lot of need to go back and check definitions and think about relevant factual scenarios that have occurred before in the law that are very relevant to this highly specific scenario your client is going through. So, that's a common use case that I'll see litigators use, is they might have they can't do it through Jade or Ostley or something because it can't be captured in a keyword search what they want. So they're looking for something like, I've had a client with this very specific situation that something's happened to their car and it's got these other variables attached to it. So they can use Habeas for that. So I see it as people who, are in that smaller state, but still excellent litigators, like still highly specialized. A lot of our practitioners right now have like 15 to 20 years of PQE. So we have a lot more people on that side who have many years of post-qualified experience, as opposed to, say, the junior lawyers. And I think a lot of junior lawyers could also have excellent experiences with Habeas, but that requires getting into, say, larger enterprise firms, because most juniors are sort of locked behind what their organization sanctions and like what tech they use. So yeah, that's kind of our average client at the moment, and the people who are really resonating the most with the product and having these aha moments where a previous workflow that took them like several hours feels really magical now, because it can take, a couple of minutes or less to just get to a relevant authority that they need quicker,
And I guess just on that point, I'm curious about the challenges that you face running a platform operating in such a heavily regulated industry.
Yeah.
How do you maneuver through that?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the that is like probably one of the biggest challenges about this industry in particular. So much potential, but then almost so much risk and compliance side of things, which can be highly complex. And I think that is one of the factors that makes it harder for like smaller startups to maybe break through. Whereas in other industries, you might see like a smaller startup just break through just on the quality of their tech alone or something like that, right? Or people are like, yeah, we just need to adopt this. But actually, yeah, in an industry like this, risk and compliance is really essential. So you need to have a really thoughtful approach to how you handle security and where you store data for your platform. For example, like with Habeas, all of our data having to be stored onshore, like any user conversations with the platform, any searches submitted, stored in like trusted database systems that these firms can validate. So we have like a compliance platform that we've sort of coded and we send to firms as well so they can sort of validate all our sub-processes and where is information coming to and from. But yeah, even then, I still also think that's the other component of that is like perception as well. So sometimes a company might just even back or go with a much larger client that has some kind of enterprise perception that, yeah, they're probably going to be more secure, whether or not that's actually the case under the hood. And so it is almost like a psychological factor that you really need to be aware of. And I think it points to this like broader issue in Australia, which is that we very often, and we're seeing this right now in AI, like we lose the race on some of these amazing technological advances because we're so concerned about the risk and compliance side, which is extremely important, by the way. Like it is extremely important, but we build whole industries out of like compliance and risk. In fact, in Australia, like the proliferation of like compliance tech is probably one of the most successful industries that's leveraged AI. And it's like you have to think about like, okay, that's a great thing in some respects, but is it also like an indictment of some of the ways that we do things here? Whereas I do think like, say in America, they'll be willing to say back a younger founder or a younger startup that isn't yet quite as validated or isn't maybe the most secure compared to say Microsoft, but to work with them and like expose them and help them along the journey. Like I think there's a little bit more of that mentality that I've seen in the US and legal tech and how companies like Harvey got started in 2023 and 2024, and you know what they were able to do even when their product yet wasn't maybe at that stage where it was enterprise ready. So it's an interesting kind of theme to reflect on in Australian tech generally, not just legal
Absolutely.
tech.
Yeah. What have you done? You know, like just thinking around the compliance on your side.
Well, there is the compliance basic. You do have to make sure, like you were talking about data onshore. That's a consideration that I don't think like people would generally think about, but it is quite important for businesses and I would say especially the legal profession.
I would argue working with different clients, and I've worked a little in the health space. And I wanted to work more in the health space, but it's just so tricky because of that data security, ethics. And to your point, I think China, US rocketing ahead, but it's not the same from a regulatory point of view. And I think that is actually, to your point, I don't necessarily think it's a totally negative thing. I think it really has its purpose. But it can stifle innovation and it can stifle adoption, especially because of people are just scared. They're just like, well, I don't know where this is going to be. I don't know who has access to it. I've had very basic projects with health clients, and just from an ethical point of view, they're like, I don't want you to access my data. And I was like,
it's going to be very difficult to build a solution that works for them if you can't in some way access
sort
or
of on the outside guessing, you know. It's bloody tricky.
And there certainly are like safe ways to do that, but I think this is the other, it like exposes some tensions in the way that some, again, not every firm in Australia is like this, by the way, but some larger enterprises you'll kind of get for external vendors or people they engage with, you know, very high bar around like compliance and security, which is important, but then at the same time you go to speak to junior lawyers and people on the ground level of these firms, and then you hear stories like, oh no, like we've been like a lot of people in the firm are submitting all sorts of internal docs to like Claude, ChatGPT, like it's going on, or things are being revealed even if they're not submitting internal docs. So it's like, well, you know, that should be almost like the key priority layer, which is that you've got these general purpose tools which are already being used by all sorts of curious, and tech-ready practitioners, sometimes in irresponsible ways, right?
Yeah.
And rather than, kind of almost trying to highly focus in on like, what was this one external provider got all of these different security layers and elements to it. And you're actually probably going to get a higher security chance that like an external provider like us has thought about that in a lot of depth and has like put in place protocols and has thought about like the ramifications than say the way that, again, a junior lawyer might engage with like, public access legal tech. So it's really, really fascinating area. But definitely I think bottom line for us is just we have to keep building to be compliant and to be aware of like things like the generative AI practice note as well, which came out in like New South Wales. And that's been a really important guide. Like there's certain things you cannot do by the letter of it, like effectively like submitting affidavits generated with AI. But it was pretty liberal towards like understanding that it's going to have a real role to play in legal research. So that note was good for us, I feel like, because we could comply with it. Yeah. We could show like our practitioners how we're working to comply with what was in that practice note effectively. Yeah,
good one. Yeah, I did see the judge in that case basically saying, they're not anti-AI. They understand that there's a place for it. It's just, how you use it.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, definitely. So it sounds like as well, it's been a bit of a, tension area with you as like starting off with, at the moment, it's like you're building a few products or a core product as well, and it's going to be a big thing to think about.
Yeah, exactly. I think, and what you mentioned about how I think the philosophy of move fast and break things is probably a lot more well adopted in the US. Yep. And I think it's a conversation that I've been having with the engineer that I've been working with. Because I think my approach has been like before we actually commercialize the product, just move fast, break it. Let's see what works. Let's see what changes. Let's see what we need to change before we actually sort of implement it with sensitive information. We'll figure out the security later. Let's figure out like the application and the usefulness upfront.
Are you having these questions from clients though? Like do clients ever sort of interrogate where this data is being stored or what you're doing with it, anything like that?
Well, with the service business, we did have one client who does contracting for the government, and for them it was a very serious part of the contract process for when they signed up. That was, they dug into that. Where is data stored? How is our data used? Where are our company files going to be kept? And we use Microsoft, the Microsoft suite. So I could safely say in that instance where like client files are kept in SharePoint, like there are data centers across Australia. So we know that's safe.
You're like, it's in the cloud somewhere.
It's in the cloud somewhere. It's safe. Trust Microsoft, not me. But I think from like with a platform that you do sort of use the API for like your LLM, sending that information, I guess, somewhere else. I think the other part that you mentioned, it is being used in businesses, like as in, like Claude, ChatGPT, whichever like LLM provider is being used, the policies don't necessarily reflect the reality. And I think part of it is an education piece both to the executives, but also to team members at an entry level. Probably thinking, how can they get through their work quicker, but they're probably causing that much of an impact to data security or
That said, I was at Victorian Supreme Court a couple of months ago, and I was on their Wi-Fi network, and I couldn't access ChatGPT. Like it was totally blocked. Yeah.
Oh, right. Interesting. Yeah, that is interesting because that's another like use case I see is we did a phone integration, like just a very basic. It's not really an app, but it's more just like people can access Habeas from a phone because there were a few practitioners who are like, oh, if I'm in court and someone raises something that is like a totally new issue or definition, maybe I can check that on the fly, right? So I actually think, that's an interesting example of like, okay, just shut it down and maybe we don't have to deal with it. And maybe they don't want like self-represented litigants, like, just sitting in the court typing on ChatGPT or something, which would of course be like
that would be incredible.
That would be, a bit of a nuisance for the judge. So like I can understand that obviously, but it is a bit of it's a double-edged sword, I guess.
And I guess just on that point, have you had some tricky conversations with potential clients in terms of getting it across the line, in terms of their maybe unwillingness to adopt AI, their skepticism, fear, anything like that?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think particularly, again, this industry, and, not something I necessarily knew when I started out building Habeas, about like the extent of, the complexity, I think. Firstly, more on the enterprise sales element of things. So I think we actually get a lot of self-serve users who understand like basically how this stuff works and how they can leverage in their practice, what they need to be aware of. And some self-serve users I never have a conversation with, and they just, use it in their own capacity when they need it. But when it comes to the enterprise sales thing, 100%, because if you're trying to engage with, say, a principal of a firm or a knowledge leader, like they are going to have a lot of extensive questions about like, how you're handling the security piece, what differentiates your technology, how is this complementary to other things we're doing in our suite. And like so many of those factors just like come into play, and so it becomes a very difficult process, I think, to push new tech through and like get it out there. So this is the other thing about legal tech, is there's probably a lot of other startups in a similar position, whereas like you've got that complexity of, they might have an excellent product specialized for a very particular area, but it is the marketing and sales piece which will sometimes get things across the line. And that sometimes leads to the unfortunate reality that sometimes practitioners get equipped with like a worse tool, maybe because that tool is a bit more like hyped up at that point in time.
Yeah.
And we have seen instances of like some of the firms here in Australia reporting like, oh, we've gotten a bit burnt on this, a few of these pilots that we did recently. And so that again leads to skepticism of like, well, would we really want to take a risk with another startup? Like, you may say that your tech is very differentiated and specialized, but we've heard that same spiel before. So these are the complex like questions going through the mind of people who like, whose jobs it is to like evaluate this technology. And it's entirely reasonable that like, with so much smoke and mirrors, people are not always going to make the perfect decision. It's more of a matter of just like adjusting. If I think a lot of knowledge leaders say this, if they get something a bit wrong, look somewhere else or engage with someone else, So, yeah.
Good one.
So you've built a technically complicated, and not complicated, but very technical product. I'd like to explore, what have you built for yourself in your own workflows?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the interesting thing for my own workflows is a lot of the ways I'm leveraging AI in terms of like business side of things. So initially when I started out, I was always just thinking about the tech stack, and that's where my head was at, like the tech stack for Habeas. And I think as you progress a little bit as a founder, you start realizing it's much more important to think about like, the operations, like what you're using for operating your business and the stack for that. So there's like just so many awesome tools that I leverage day to day, and like whether there's self-serve tools and stuff for the business side of things. So I think a combination of old and new tech. So I try and keep things, simple on the email side, and use things like Gmail's, Google Workspace and integrated tools like that. But I also integrate tools like for email sending tools like Gmass, etc., that can be integrated in that suite to make it really simple. We don't do too much like direct email apart from, a certain, time of the year if we need to send out like an email newsletter or something. Then also like a lot of platforms that I'll use, like Gamma, for example. Okay. So it's really good for like if you already have a written piece on something, turning that into a presentation or like a minimal presentation. Gamma has been really a lifesaver in a lot of situations. Like previously you might have to architect like, a PowerPoint slideshow, and it's just a one-off thing, and that might take you 4 or 5 hours to get it really right. I think with Gamma it like shortcuts that quite a bit, and it also is getting better and better as a platform. So I'm using that quite a bit. Obviously using like tools like ChatGPT and Claude more for ideation on the business side of things. So like struggling with a problem, how do I approach this? So using it as like a thinking partner for certain things, but definitely not for everything. So it's just like, I think there are some interesting areas where like OpenAI, because they've integrated like a memory function quite well in the platform, that has sometimes become a default point of choice because it at least has some tangible memory of like who you are and what you do. So that's been like an important tool day to day. And then of course, like on the dev end, like now just experimenting in the last few years on and off with, tools like Cursor and N8N and, a whole bunch of sort of AI automation type platforms. But I would say now we're at the stage where it's like I try not to be thinking too much about like what is going on, because there's every single day there's a new tool, a new workflow, or a new methodology. Like, for example, like MCP became, the talked about thing in the dev world for a couple of months in particular. And I was just like, I took a look at it and I was like, look, this looks awesome if I was building a slightly different type of product, or I was focused on still the tech end of Habeas as what I thought the weakness of, what we're doing was, and it needed to be addressed. But I didn't see how for us that would be adding extra utility to the product. So I actually focused away from it. Like I'm trying to intentionally not just like be caught up in the research element of day-to-day engagement, because otherwise that kind of takes you away from your core focus, which is getting a product out there to market and stuff.
So Will, just curious to get your take on how you see the role of the lawyer evolving over the next few years, especially as, I guess, tech develops.
Yeah, look, I think the role of the lawyer, it's a big discussion in the profession at the moment. And, I've spoken about this quite a bit. So I think some of the more manual tasks, like there used to be this association that if you get into the profession, first few years you're in a chamber somewhere or a dungeon doing discovery work for the firm. You really, are grinding those first couple of years. I think we're seeing a bit of a shift away from that because, people now have access to more nuanced analytical tools that like allow them to do a lot of like the initial sort of deep retrieval work can be done like by a tool like Habeas. And so that might save someone like hours of manual drudgery. And so I do see that at least with some of our practitioners, it really does feel like it's freeing them up for a slightly different, more like they can spend a little bit more time engaging with the client or like getting deeper into the client's needs or thinking like much more closely about a very nuanced argument or an interesting case of like reasoning by analogy on something that otherwise maybe they just don't quite have the time for. So I think that's one element of where things are already starting to change. Like it's something I'm seeing like through the use of generative AI. The other thing is I think, lawyers are going to have to respond to, competing pressures around a lot of like self-represented litigants popping up, and a lot of small businesses in particular now electing to do like 80 or 90% of the work through AI, and then maybe getting that checked by a lawyer. Like that's a process that I've seen quite frequently. Or people wanting demand for AI-enabled law firms where they know that they're actually going to get a cheaper price, right? They're actually going to get something that they still feel is maybe validated, but people, especially in small businesses and self-represented litigants, there's a real concern around cost as well. So that's going to shift things up quite a bit, and you'll see a lot more firms effectively like changing their business models in creative ways or in creative strategies. You'll also see a consolidation of, the firms that rely on billable hours and that sort of stuff, and wanting to consolidate that model and protect it. So it's going to go in slightly different ways. And I think just thinking what else can we say about like the role of the lawyer? They're now going to have a bit of a focus on some different skills, right? So AI is in that realm of where it can create a lot of plausible sounding information. And there's now going to be a kind of an excess of information, an excess of written language around various legal issues. People are going to have to get much better at like validation and checking around like and applying their own critical thinking to outputs, rather than thinking so much about like just can we get this advice done in the amount of time. It's going to like prioritize slightly different skills for the lawyer to learn and think about, and really to like make sure that they're keeping up with like the advances in AI, and that like they're not, because I've seen certain instances of practitioners complaining to me that one of their clients has said, look, I'm using AI for a lot of the work I'm doing. I no longer need you as my lawyer. And a lot of lawyers are like, well, of course, see you later, and that's going to be a problem for you down the line, and that may be true, right? But we need to be aware of like what does that signal on the client's end, like what are they thinking about, and how, if a client feels that way about the role of the lawyer changing, how can lawyers adapt? How can they have like more AI first and like 21st century sort of business models and stuff like that? Yeah, for sure.
That's super interesting just to see the industry change in that way, like people self-serving. That's crazy. Like that's really interesting.
Yeah, 100%. And we're also seeing, unfortunately, then you get the divergent use cases. Like we're much more targeted to legal professionals because they definitely know like how to use these tools better and how to think about like the ramifications and what's going on under the hood. But you've also seen a few cases of like self-represented litigants just using ChatGPT and really like landing themselves in some hot water. And yeah, so, but again, I don't like to approach that with a perspective of scrutiny or like too much criticism. I just like think about, well, what does that say like under the hood? In Australia, we have like a really bad like sort of legal aid and access to justice problem. Like I think it's something like 80% of legal matters, etc., don't really even get seen. They don't get the time they deserve because people can't even access these services in a meaningful way. So either they just sort of try and resolve it through other means or legal means, or they just don't get represented. And it's like we shouldn't just point and laugh at people, but actually be respectful of the fact that, you know, this is a real problem. There's a cost of living crisis. And, you know, it's entirely reasonable that if I'm a self-represented litigant and I'm doing it a bit tough in my life, I may not be able to go to a lawyer who's going to charge me, you know, $300 to $500 an hour. I might have to seek a different path, even if that's a little bit ineffective in certain ways, right? But at least, you know, it can help with navigating the law. AI definitely can help, you know, narrow down complex concepts and like bring them into a more simple light, or it can be used for client triage or things like that. So I think a lot of centres and like access to justice centres in Australia here are actually actively exploring it from the conversations we've been having as well, how they can leverage AI in smart but sensible ways for sure.
And I guess that sort of rolls into one of my next questions. Do you see the role of Habeas supporting that more agentic style law firm that will be able to reduce costs for the user?
Yeah, I mean, we already support a few firms who've adopted that model and are using Habeas a little bit like on the back end of their service, but not just Habeas. Like Habeas is in that research realm, but they might use a separate tool for like contracts, right? They might have there's all sorts of software being developed for legal contracts, right? So they might buy a separate SaaS product over here and combine a few ones. And, you know, that might sound a little bit expensive, but actually these practitioners are more than making up, because they can either take on more matters or they can do, you know, the current work that they're doing in a more efficient or effective way. And so, yeah, we are already supporting a few firms, and like really just I'm always having conversations with lawyers who are in that space and looking to adapt and change and like bring change to the industry. Some of them, you know, struggle doing that because it is such a hard industry for change management and stuff. So yeah, it's already happening, definitely. And it's exciting to see that. I think in the US, you know, there's a lot of interest around, you know, almost the VC space is now getting into AI first law firms as well, like Y Combinator, which is always interesting, and good luck to them. But that's more of a winner takes all type market. Like you're going to get a lot more like small law firms that just want to be a bit more efficient and modernize the way that they do practice and advertise to their clients that like we are AI aware. We're not actually just operating in a totally like pre-AI way. We understand this technology because that's what clients demand of them, you know.
And Will, I guess just on the back of Christian's question, curious about your journey as a founder to obviously build out Habeas as a company. Are you a reluctant founder? Was this always the plan? How did you go about being an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I guess so for me, because I started out in more of a uni setting where I was studying humanities-oriented type subjects, I wasn't, like, certainly when I was 18, I wasn't necessarily thinking, oh, I want to become an entrepreneur. That wasn't, I think also just like through lack of exposure, right? Like when you're in high school, etc. I think even a career in tech wasn't fully talked about as like, hey, this is one of the options. Like in our high school, maybe it was kind of like a lot of the traditional paths might be like they go into legal or doctor or, you know, some of those career pathways, which are excellent pathways, of course, right? But just being aware that like, oh, okay, there is this possible second route of rather than just going do university, get a few internships and hopefully try and land a great job, maybe you could build something for yourself. And that's going to be a more complex process. Like you can't expect that to be easy. And I don't think I ever did. I think, you know, I underestimated the complexity a bit, as every first time type founder does. But yeah, so I ended up getting into entrepreneurship just out of almost the previous path I was going down wasn't working. I wanted something that gave me a bit more freedom and autonomy in a way. And I felt like in a university setting, and I was like, I had other energy, I had other stuff I wanted to learn and build and grow. And so another interesting part of the story, I guess, is even before Habeas, we ran, like me and a co-founder ran a tech startup in like the crypto space. So that space to me, I was interested in. And again, the theme is like, how can we bring a newer tech to an older business, an older style of like, or way of doing things. I think that's a common thread. But what I found was like with that business, and we made a bit of money off it and stuff, but I also found that crypto was at that point in time the Wild West. Like it didn't seem to be like a super serious or well-regulated market, and people were just sort of buying stuff on the basis of hype. So I actually went down that very considered like product route of like, we need to build the best product. It's going to be the best offering out there. All these other products suck, and it turned out like we still lost out to the people who were like, basically selling nothing but vaporware under the hood, right? And so, again, that gave me a good learning, which I probably should have even thought about a bit more for the context of Habeas, as I am more focused on the product mentally.
Yeah.
But yeah, like all in all, I think entrepreneurship was more of a really interesting path that just sort of emerged as I was on a journey, and almost frustrates or some of the limitations of just when you maybe don't have that autonomy in like other settings. Tech is so interesting because you can build something yourself. You can put it out into the world. You can eventually, create something where you're sort of bending the nature of reality like a little bit, but it's very hard because, of course, reality likes to bend back. So, interesting sort of career that's now being enabled by 21st century tech and all the changes we're seeing. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, incredible.
But yeah, how do you guys like get into it? Like, because in particular, I'm interested in like with you've been in tech for a little bit now, like quite a few years, but also in your instance, you said you haven't done as much on the product side initially, but now that's really one of your key focuses. Like you used to be highly focused on HR, some that elements, and now you're really interested in product and coding and all this sort of stuff, right?
Yeah. Well, I guess for me, HR backgrounds, building a HR services business, I think was the goal, and it wasn't the goal initially to sort of stumble upon what's possible in the AI space, or just creating a product that might be able to, from my perspective, ultimately collapse the barrier to entry or the barrier to information to for in my case, the user that needs it most, which would be the business owner or the HR team. So I think I see the possibilities just for small and medium businesses to create efficiency, but also just move quick. So I've got no real experience with building product or even coding. So I am trying to draw on those around me, but also continue to build the service business, because what I'm finding is that there are some businesses out there that still want to keep that white glove approach, while also have the opportunity for, like what you said before, the lower cost service provider, which is AI enabled. So I guess that's my journey, still on the journey, and I guess these conversations help sort of fuel that journey as well.
100%, but it's one of those instances where maybe if you just think, it is a bit of a paradigm shift, because like my grandfather, or for example, it wasn't necessarily an open career option. This notion of you might actually work a job for many years, then maybe you'll switch into a bit of building your own business. Like that wasn't really a viable. It's like you have quite a set career path, right? And it is really interesting to see now that even if you feel like, okay, I don't have as much product official experience, you do have like valuable skills and knowledge from all of your years in HR, which now you're going to be able to build probably a much more effective product for that industry than someone who is, for example, a developer with 10 years but no experience in HR, right? So it's just about that gap, and you now almost with self-learning and stuff as well,
exactly,
and stuff that you're teaching yourself every day. It's that gap.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's the the theme out there at the moment, that build for the vertical, and you need to understand what the vertical is to be able to build in it. So I think that's the space that I'm trying to play in.
Yeah.
But I think getting to the product and getting to, I guess, the solution that businesses need is a different story.
This has been a great chat, Will. I think just as a last question, I guess, curious to know some of the highs as a founder, some of the lows, and if you have any advice to potential founders out there, aspiring founders.
Yeah, wow. It's a loaded question, isn't it? It's a complex one. I think, so in terms of the highs or highs versus the lows, like what are the pros, what are the cons and stuff, I think, there's this thing of whilst you're actually building your own thing, whatever that is, whether it's successful, whether it hasn't quite reached the market yet, etc., you are in the game. Like you're in a space where you have a new kind of leverage where, in a setting of, say, employment, you might have a more specific set of tasks and things you need to do day to day. But if you're running a business, there's always scope to change, to pivot. And there's that creative element where you know that like if you keep going and iterating your understanding of like a market or a problem, you will find some form of success. And then it's up to you to find like, is that form of success what I want? Is it the form of success I was looking for? Or do I want to go down a slightly different path, right? So I think that's the exciting thing, which is enabled by being a founder. And I think it's quite good for those who maybe are self-learners, like they really feel like they can back themselves and do a range of tasks and wear a range of hats. In terms of like the highs and lows, I think along the journey, there's been a few highs, like when we've landed a few enterprise pilots with like some of the biggest law firms in Australia. Whether or not those were just free pilots or paid pilots, it still felt really, really energizing to know that like they were giving us a look in at all. And they were also then when you got, really great feedback from lawyers in those firms with like 20 years PQE and like, oh, no, I love this. I used it for this thing or I use it for this task. Like that is very energizing. And I think now also some of the recent testimonials we've gotten from like, which are now echoing some of the same feedback, like that starts to energize you quite a bit. And just, generally, I think a lot of steps along the process, like when you're solving more problems or day to day, you get little wins, I'm sure. But I think, in terms of some of the low points and stuff, I think just founders need to understand that, like, especially if you're selling into a B2B type industry, there's going to be a lot of complexity. It's not necessarily just the success stories you see on the news, people raising hundreds of millions of dollars. Like, that's not necessarily the average startup journey or founder journey. You're going to have to spend so much time learning, iterating, copying it. You're going to have to get good at and I'm still not great at this, but get good at embracing rejection along the way. Like understanding that rejection could come in for multiple terms. It could even just be that someone is literally busy. They have other priorities. Your product could be awesome or whatever you're doing could be great. It could solve a real problem for them, but that doesn't entitle you to win someone's business or win someone's work, right? So, get good at that, enduring rejection thing. And then I think there's some, founder stories where they'll kind of say if you just keep doing this for 5 years and you endure the rejection, you'll necessarily win. I think there's some truth to the fact that, the longer the game you are, the more longer in the game you are, the more you achieve. But there are limits to that. Like you don't want to put yourself through a scenario where you're just not enjoying the work you're doing anymore. And if you find yourself in that position as a founder, you need to realign either what you're doing or your business model or how you're working with people or what you're promising clients or your price point or something, right? So just not accepting that it's all has to be bad and negative, and that sort of mentality that's out there at the moment around founders and the sort of Hormozy and some of these influencers who are maybe espouse that a little bit. So it's it's a bit of I think you've got those highs and lows along the journey. And I think in terms of, there's so much other, advice points or things I guess I could try and give to people. But the main one is just understanding the complexity of the journey. It's not necessarily going to be a win in a day type scenario, particularly if you're starting an AI business. There is just so much competition and stuff out there. And so learning to go deep into an industry and understand the nuances of who you're working with, who your client is, what they care about, becomes a really valued skill. And then another thing, this is just popped into my head, but is the value of getting out there in the real world. So like you might see compared to 5 years ago, direct email, LinkedIn, and some of these strategies were espoused as like that's what you need to be doing, hundreds of messages a day. That's what people would say for marketing. Increasingly, they're not working. Like people don't buy in that same way of like maybe coming into a funnel or however it's described. Due to the rise of AI, people are really concerned about even personalized outreach being insincere, right? So one of the best strategies you might have is like getting yourself into a community or at least meeting people at conferences and events. And we started doing more of that this year, which I didn't do last year, but I regret that a bit. That's just a learning, because then you actually meet real people who can trust and see what you're doing and what you're about, and like how confidently you can speak about your offer and what you do, and like they can suss you out pretty quickly. And so get out there a little bit more and don't assume that you can build a business just all from your keyboard at home, because it might actually be more complex, at least for certain types of businesses, like the B2B SaaS type businesses that I'm in that world. So that's just a few things off the top of my head, but I'm sure there's so much more to discuss,
Oh, awesome. Thank you, Will.
Yeah, no, it's been awesome. And, thank you for inviting me. It's, I think my first podcast experience. So I'm sure there's, a few elements to improve on and everything, but hopefully some of it has been of interest. And definitely.
I'm sure whoever's listening needed some tips, tricks, advice. I think you've built a pretty awesome product. See it out there on LinkedIn. And making an impact.
You got to get it out there. I mean, through whatever means possible.
That's it.
Awesome. All right, well, thanks guys. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks for joining us. Awesome. Thank you, mate. Thanks everybody. See you next time.